So I'm going to start, as usual, with a discussion of Adorno and Horkheimer and a bit of the Frankfurt School, though, as may become my habit from now on, I'm going to cut this down a little bit because otherwise we'll run out of time. Then we'll look at three main concepts and their application to critical theory and IR. We'll look at immanent critique, we'll look at the dialectic of enlightenment, and we'll look at negative dialectics. Okay, so the Frankfurt School was located in the Institute for Social Research, which was the first ever Marxist research unit actually in a university, established in Frankfurt in 1923. Now, all of the participants shared a few things in common. For one thing, they all shared an interest in German idealism, of which Hegel, who we've looked at briefly already last week, was a prominent example. And more importantly, they all shared an interest in the thought of Karl Marx, who also was strongly influenced himself by German idealism. Now, broadly, the original focus of the Institute was in explaining why Marx's predictions actually got things so wrong. Because if you recall, Marx had this historical materialist idea of history, right? So the material base of the society determines the nature of that society, and the contradictions within this base was what moved history from one era to the next. So this was this deterministic kind of view of history. And it saw communism as inevitably arising from within capitalism, just as capitalism inevitably arose from within feudalism. Actually, hold on. Okay, now I think we're recording. Okay. Okay. So this is Marx's view, but this is not actually what was actually happening. Like, first, there was the so-called abortive socialism of the USSR. This wasn't communism by Marx's understanding of it, and also it never should have arisen according to his dialectical view of history. It was an anomaly. The conditions based in the internal contradictions of capitalism were not present in the case of the Russian Revolution. Yet there was a so-called socialist revolution anyway. Furthermore, in those places in which capitalism was most advanced, so the industrialized Western Europe, so Germany and the UK, for example, Marx would have predicted significant movement towards socialism. Again, this is the more advanced capitalism is, the closer it's going to be towards a socialist revolution. And so Marx would have thought that, yeah, we would have been seeing sort of the proto-socialist kind of activities taking place. But instead, we find fascism and authoritarianism taking over, particularly in Germany, right? And classical Marxism just couldn't really explain this. Why were we getting fascism rather than socialism? So the Frankfurt School aimed to develop a more sophisticated picture of society that could help to understand these problems. And it was a project that was broadly Marxist in orientation. Specifically, it upheld this Marxist commitment to radical social change, and it also drew heavily on Marxist theory in other respects, but it also aimed to try and move beyond it. And in particular, it tried to incorporate other philosophical strands into its broadly Marxian analysis of society. So, yeah. Now, as we've already discussed, critical theory differs from traditional theory in a number of significant respects, one of which is that it sees all theory as socially embedded. So there's no such thing as an objective theory. The theorist is never detached from the social world of which they're a part. All theorizing, all scientific activity is itself part of the social fabric, right? It's part of the system of capitalism if the society itself is capitalist. By challenging this idea, by challenging what Horkheimer calls bourgeois scientific thought, critical theory aims to transform society rather than just explain society. I mean, it's doing both. It's doing explanation, but it also wants to transform society. When Horkheimer took over this institute, the thought was that the institute could help to develop the critical social consciousness of the masses, and in doing so, start to transform society in a more emancipatory direction. But unfortunately, these ideas were fairly short-lived. The rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s made Horkheimer reconsider the extent to which the proletariat could develop this critical social consciousness at all. And what's more, the members of the Institute, most of whom were Jewish, and of course all of whom were socialists, had to flee Germany to protect their own lives. In 1933, due to the Nazi takeover, the Institute temporarily transferred to Geneva, and then in 1935 to New York in Columbia University. Now, the Frankfurt School, it continues until the present day, but for the purpose of our discussion, this sort of brief potted history is pretty much all you need to know. And I think it maybe helps to situate Adorno's thought a little bit, at least. So having to flee the Nazis, right, and seeing his native Germans embrace the Nazi Party with such fervor was a really strong influence on his thought, right? I think it helps explain some of the pessimism of his work and Horkheimer's work as well. Now, there are a number of really key ideas developed by Adorno that have been pretty highly influential on critical theory. In a wide range of disciplines, not just international relations. And the first of these that I want to look at is the idea of immanent critique. So this concept was originally developed by Horkheimer, who in turn drew on Hegel and Marx for inspiration. And the basic idea is that we ought to abandon what we can call an Archimedean point of view. So a God's eye view, for example, when we're engaging in critique. So we can think of critique, therefore, as operating in two possible ways. So in the first, we would say, hey, look, here's our standard of judgment. We can assess something based on how well it matches up against this standard. And importantly, the standard is external to the thing that's being critiqued, right? So in terms of international relations, we might say something like the following, right? The government says, hey, we're going to attack this country over here because we want to open up their market for our goods. And this kind of critique, a transcendent critique, critique that stands outside the thing being criticized, might then say, no, you can't do that because there are just wars and there are unjust wars, and that's not a just war. Right? That critique is outside the object that is being critiqued. So, for something to be a just war, you have to be engaging in self-defense, for example, and attacking another country because it won't open its markets to you is not self-defense. Therefore, what you're doing is unacceptable. So, as I said, this criticism is external to the thing being criticized. It's taking this Archimedean point of view, right, in which the observer, in which the critic is looking at the issue from a supposedly objective position, and they're making their judgment on the action on that basis. But I think if you've learned one thing from about critical theory in this course so far, it should be that critical theory is deeply suspicious of any possibility of this objective point of view. As we've discussed, for critical theorists, claiming that there's any kind of objective view at all usually just sneaks in a subjective point of view and claims that it's an objective point of view without being clear about that. And this raises as well the problem of if we have no external position from which to critique something, how do we then critique it? Right? How do you critique something if you don't have this external standard that you can then measure that thing up to? So if there aren't objective standards by which something can be criticized, then we might want to say, well, that just means that everything is a matter of subjective opinion. That there are no standards, that everything is just up to individuals or up to societies to decide whether something is right or wrong, right? Now, critical theory doesn't want to say that everything is subjective, right, in this really strong sense of subjective. They don't want to say that critique is just a matter of opinion, that when I say you shouldn't do something, that's just me expressing my own personal view, that there's nothing, there's no bite to my criticism. Because if that were the case, if critique was just a matter of subjective opinion, why would anyone care? Like, if someone disagreed with me, why would they care about my critique? They'd just say, well, that's not what I think, goodbye, that's the end, right? and that would be the end of the matter. There'd be no critique. It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't work. And if that were the case, critical theory would be completely neutered. It would have no purpose. It would accomplish absolutely nothing in the world. It would be unable to even say anything truly meaningful about the world. It would just be, as I said, just the expression of a subjective point of view. So how does critical theory get around this problem? How does it get around the problem that it doesn't want to have an objective point of view, but it also doesn't want to have a subjective point of view either? It does this through this concept of immanent critique. So the idea of immanent critique is that it's able to criticize, to critique a thing using the presuppositions, either the explicitly or the implicitly articulated presuppositions of that thing, right? It identifies a gap between what a certain value proposes, what a value stands for, that people actually hold, and what is actually being done. So there's a gap between what people, or the implications of a value that people hold, and what people are actually doing as a matter of practice. And in doing so, it's able to find a contradiction in those values and those practices. And I think we can see how this might work using the earlier example. We've got one state invading another state to open it up to trade. So an immanent critique would say something along the lines of this. This is very broad, but they wouldn't say, hey, there's this universal standard, you're breaking, the rules of war or something like that. Rather, they'd say, you are not living up to your own commitments, to the standards that are implicit in your own actions and in your own values, right? So, for example, the immanent critic might say, what's the purpose of your invasion? You're invading another country, why are you doing that? And in this case, the purpose is to open that country up to free trade and extend the free market, right? And why? Why are you doing that? Well, many people might think that free market extends human freedom, right? Maximizes human freedom. If we have a free market, then human beings are more free, right? So basically, the ultimate purpose of this invasion is to promote human freedom. Now, on the face of it, this is kind of a contradiction, right? It's taking away people's freedom, or maybe even killing them, in order to make them free. And that's something that's internal to the position of the person or the country doing the invading. Right? Their own reasons are then turned against them and shown to be internally contradictory, so that hopefully they're able to then see that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. This is not, importantly, an external standard. This is an internal standard. It's being assessed according to the values of the action or the people themselves. It's saying you claim to be doing this for one reason, according to this particular value, this value of human freedom, but you're actually accomplishing just the opposite. You're undermining human freedom by doing what you're doing. And hopefully this is going to persuade people. So the basic idea of immanent critique, it's pretty important, and I think on Thursday we'll see it come up again in the work of Habermas, and in particular in his work on discourse ethics. But really, it's really an incredibly important idea for critical theory generally. But Adorno, later in his career, isn't totally persuaded by Horkheimer's idea of immanent critique. And the reason why is tied closely to his broader ideas, and in particular, his criticism of the idea of enlightenment. Right? So we'll take a bit of a detour here to examine his and Horkheimer's views in their work, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, which is a very, very difficult but very important book. So Dialectic of Enlightenment, maybe perhaps unsurprisingly, argues for a specific way of understanding the term enlightenment. And it's a bit different from the usual way of understanding enlightenment. So what, for you, what associations did the word enlightenment bring to you? What do you think of when you hear the term enlightenment? Yep. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's important. Knowledge and understanding. So it's the increase of knowledge and understanding, right? Yep. Anything else? Yeah.
Discovery is a few ways to discover information.
So like the creation of the scientific method and so on? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? So these are some of the key ideas in our traditional understanding of enlightenment, right? So we think of it as being a period of history, and particularly a period of Western history that sweeps away our previous superstitious views of the world and ushered in this modern understanding of science and philosophy and society and politics, right? It was the rise, as you say, of the scientific method. It was a time of human reason and rational argument, where this, reason and argument became ascendant over religious dogma. It's a time in which monarchies and other hierarchical systems of government were overthrown and replaced by political systems based in these ideas of freedom and equality and so on. And typically it's taken to be something that is unequivocally positive. Right? It's this great thing. It's what gave us this wonderful modern world in which we live. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer, on the other hand, provide a different, kind of less salubrious account of enlightenment. They understand it in a slightly more negative way. But, importantly, they're not writing from a reactionary point of view. Right? They aren't simply saying, things were great the way they were before. Why can't we go back to, the old ways, the pre-modern kind of ways? That's absolutely not what they're saying. Rather, Adorno and Horkheimer say that myth is already enlightenment, and that enlightenment reverts to mythology. Right? These are two rather cryptic claims, so I'll try and cash them out as best I can. And to understand both of these, we need to understand a little bit Adorno and Horkheimer's view of history. So for them, human beings throughout their history have been consistently attempting to preserve themselves against nature, right? Because nature, I think, after all, kind of works against us in many ways, and so human civilization can be thought of as the ground that humanity has managed to take from nature, right? It's a process of the domination of nature. Because the more we can dominate nature, the more secure our own existences are. And because of this, of course, knowledge is incredibly important. Knowledge is necessary for self-preservation. Knowledge gives us power over nature. It allows us to develop techniques by which we can dominate nature and secure our own existence. So when Adorno and Horkheimer claim that myth is already enlightenment, what they mean is that the process of accumulating knowledge, the knowledge that allows us to dominate nature and secure our continued existence, is not this new thing. It's not this thing that came about just in the Enlightenment. Because myths are perhaps not expressed in the same way as scientific knowledge or modern philosophy, but myths are still knowledge, they think. They're not just these fun stories that people tell each other purely for entertainment. They're actually meaningful. They help to make sense of the world because they classify and categorize the world, right? And in this way, they're theories about the world and how we should understand it. Yep?
Do they in any way attempt to deal with what might be described as more environmentally constructive arguments? For example, the best example might be guns, germs, and steel. Do they in any kind of way attempt to deal with that?
Sorry, could you elaborate a little bit?
So say, for example, the argument is that geography realistically shapes the human experience of the large groups. And do they attempt to deal with that in any fashion?
Well, you could relate that to myth in a way, right? You could say, like, if you need certain knowledge to live in a particular place successfully, right, then the myths of a particular people are going to kind of embody that kind of knowledge, right? So that maybe even supports their point, right? Saying that myth is this thing that actually has these conceptualizations, these concepts, these categorizations that are really useful for us, or were useful for us in living in the world in which we found ourselves. Yeah, so I think absolutely. So, yeah, So myths have cognitive content, is what they want to say, all right? They're cognitive tools for human beings to use to dominate nature to secure human beings' existence. So yeah, the point here is that myths were already Enlightenment if Enlightenment is thought of as the collection of knowledge for the purpose of securing human existence. Then it's not a process that suddenly started. It's a process that goes all the way back into human history. On the other hand, they argue that Enlightenment reverts to mythology. And by this they mean that even though modernity supposedly privileges kind of technological advancement and secular rationality, it can never fully escape these mythical, these transcendent ideals that come from the past. And they use the example of Nazi ideology to illustrate this, right? The Nazis, they strongly valued modern technology, they strongly valued industrialization, but at the same time, they combine this with these appeals to this mythological Aryan past, right? And I think the Nazis might be a pretty easy group to point to show how modernity is kind of permeated by myth. It's also kind of easy to treat Nazis as the exception, right? Like they're the sort of the boogeyman. But I think for Adorno and Horkheimer, they're actually pretty typical of modernity in this respect, right? They suggest, and I think this should be becoming a somewhat familiar idea by now, that what modern people claim are completely value-free tools are actually deeply bound up with these ideological systems. That, like the instruments of modernity, science, and a certain form of rationality and technology are completely permeated by these mythical and transcendental ideas, but they're hidden and sold as being completely value-free tools. So we have, on the one hand, right, we have the idea that Enlightenment isn't this new thing, stretches back all the way to our distant past. The myths that we had in the distant past were already tools of Enlightenment, even if they weren't quite as effective as the tools we have now. On the other hand, they think the irrational part of myth, so myth has this cognitive content, this rational component, but it also has this irrational part, it's this transcendental part, the part that sees things in these grand kind of mythic terms. They say that's still present in modernity as well. Right? So we were neither as irrational in the past, as supporters of the Enlightenment like to claim, nor are we as rational now as supporters of the Enlightenment like to claim. Right? We're not disenchanted, we're not unmythological, although we like to think we are. So the Enlightenment for them is not some discontinuous phenomenon. It's like started at a particular period of history, and everything changed, and it was completely unlike everything that happened before it. It was this continuous process of change through history. So we've always had Enlightenment, and we still have myth. Right? It's not this sharp discontinuity. However, one big difference in the modern era is the power of our tools. So science and technology have increased our ability to dominate the world, dominate nature 1,000-fold from what we could do in ancient Greece, or 1,000-fold is putting it mildly, to be honest, when you think about nuclear weapons, right? And importantly, these tools are not just able to be used to dominate nature, they're also able to be used to dominate each other, right? So Adorno and Horkheimer, they identify the Nazi death camps as really this perfectly natural outcome of modernity. Right? We have this vastly increased power, we have this modern technology, we have rational industrial production, and we have these rational management techniques, and the scientific method. And all of those things together went into these death camps, right? Because myth as well, myth hasn't gone anywhere, so we've got rationality, we've got science, we've got technology, but we still have myth. So we've got these societies that are increasingly sanitized and increasingly administered using all of this technology and rationality and power on these fairly grand scales, according to these principles of modernity, according to the techniques of modernity. Yet we still have this undercurrent of myth running through almost everything that we do, right? Built into the very tools that we've created and that we claim to be merely value-free tools. So what happens as a result of this? Well, this power is put in service of the mythic, of the irrational. And the mythic sort of erupts out of these so-called rational societies in more or less violent ways. And the death camps, the Nazi death camps, are an example of this. It's literally an industrialized form of mass killing, right? And you can't really get more modern than that, like the industrialization of killing. Adorno and Horkheimer also identify culture as being subject to a similar process of domination. So industry, capitalism, rationality, all of these great tools have been put in the service of the creation of culture, which is itself also industrial, right? So culture, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, is manufactured according to these industrial capitalist logics, right? It's mass-produced. Details are changed so that we can express our supposed individuality, but in the end, it's just this process of pseudo-individualization. Nothing really significant has changed from case to case. It's enough so that we can be entertained, but it's no kind of fundamental change to this mass-produced cultural object. So we live in a world in which culture is industry, culture is not expression, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. And through this, we're taught to think and to behave in certain ways. We're taught to love the way things are. We're taught to be satisfied with repetitive lives in service of the profit of other people. And we're taught to think that fundamental changes to the way things are unpleasant, are dangerous, are worrying. So culture, too, Adorno and Horkheimer think, is, in our modern industrial society, a tool of domination rather than a tool of freedom. So, while enlightenment is this continuous process, maybe we could think of the modern world as kind of the apotheosis of the Enlightenment, right? The reason, or what Adorno and Horkheimer call instrumental reason, is a tool put ultimately in service of domination, both of nature and of other people. All of our knowledge, all of our knowledge of both the natural world and the social world, our culture, our technology, all of these things is put in the service of control and exploitation. So knowledge, they think, in the modern world, it's supposed to emancipate, right? The Enlightenment is supposed to be this big emancipatory kind of thing. Adorno and Horkheimer think that knowledge in the modern world does not emancipate. It's just another tool that can be used to keep us under control. And I think this is particularly obvious in the capitalist mode of production, right? Because according to the logic of capitalism, nothing has intrinsic value. We only have exchange value. We have what something is worth in the market, right? And because of this, everything is potentially a commodity. Everything consists in, the value of everything consists in its ability to be bought and sold. Even human beings are treated and treat each other as a means rather than an end in this way, right? I mean, how often have you heard and probably accepted the line, hey, look, it's just business, right? This line is used to justify human beings being treated in horrible ways, ways that really only make sense if you think about them not as human beings with kind of intrinsic value, but instead as commodities in the marketplace. But Horkheimer and Adorno think that inside this pessimistic view of modernity is the seed of emancipation. Now at this point, Adorno and Horkheimer think that we should engage in a process of, or form of immanent critique. And in particular, we should be able to use reason, which, as I've said, is predominantly, up to this point, a tool of enlightenment and domination, to critique this process of enlightenment itself. They think that in doing this, we can demonstrate that social freedom is inseparable from enlightened thought, truly enlightened thought. So their immanent critique of reason is intended to pave the way for this, this positive notion of enlightenment, which will release us from this kind of entanglement of blind domination that they think we're in now. So in other words, through immanent critique, we can unleash these positive aspects of enlightenment, and we can work towards social emancipation. So that was just a little, kind of a little sliver of positivity in what was otherwise a pretty negative outlook. But later on, Adorno moves away from Horkheimer on this issue, or arguably follows this view to its logical conclusion, which is a much more negative conclusion than they reached before. So even though the dialectic of enlightenment may seem like a fairly pessimistic work, this is nothing compared to what Adorno ends up with later on. Basically, Adorno comes to view social reality as pretty much pervasively evil. Society, he thinks, has become fully instrumentalized, right? It's the single integrated system of domination. No part of the system is immune from being complicit in this domination. But if society, as Adorno argues, is the self-maintaining whole, right, and if it at the same time is completely pervaded by domination and by instrumental reason, if nothing in it is completely free from this domination, then we actually have to question whether even immanent critique is possible, right? So in other words, if reason in our society is completely bound up with domination, then we have to abandon the idea that there are actually any reliable standards of criticism that come from within a society. And if so, no immanent critique of such a society is ever able to give us a truly emancipatory critical theory. For Adorno, to the extent that they're integrated into the context of immanence in this like fully instrumentalized society, standards of criticism, whatever they are, whatever kinds of standards of criticism you want to talk about, are not transcendent enough, right? Because they're incapable of pointing beyond existing social relations to a kind of society that is going to be better than the current one. All standards in an immanent critique, after all, belong to that society. They're continuous with and contaminated by this fully instrumentalized society, fundamentally based in instrumental reason and domination. So they can never be appropriate standards for a critical theory of society. Now, I think you can probably see here how he's diverging from the earlier work with Horkheimer. Purely immanent critique, he thinks, is no longer possible. It's actually no longer desirable anymore. We require this element of transcendent critique, right, if we want to move to a better society, if we want to move to an emancipated society. We probably don't want a fully transcendent critique, but we can't be fully immanent either. But then the question becomes, what resources can we draw on if we're going to make a semi-transcendent critique, right? Because transcendent critique runs into the problems we looked at earlier, that if you don't agree with the standards, you know, or that all transcendent views are perspectives that come out of a society ultimately, but are hidden and made to seem as if they're objective when they never are. So we're kind of stuck. You can't use transcendent critique, and you can't use immanent critique either. Both of them fail. Now, this interpretation of Adorno means that Adorno's view can be considered perhaps more like a message in a bottle, right? He's diagnosed, he thinks, this really deep, fundamental problem with modern society, but he thinks the problem is so deep, the problem is so fundamental, that nothing can actually be done about it. Right? Any solution is going to be part of the problem. You know, it'll be at least partly immanent, and it'll be contaminated by this logic of instrumental reason. You know, and this logic completely governs modern society. So any idea of emancipation that we get out of that society is going to be a contaminated idea of emancipation. It's not going to get us there. It won't actually be able to point to any genuine emancipatory alternative to the status quo. So his diagnosis is maybe aimed at a future society, he thinks. And maybe, however they did it, they're able to have escaped this instrumental reason, at least to a certain extent. And so maybe then his guidance may give them some idea of how to proceed from that point. But he thinks this diagnosis has absolutely no help to our current society because we're just totally compromised. We're so compromised that no kind of emancipatory program that comes out of our society is going to ever escape instrumental reason and domination. Whew, okay. All right. However, despite this seemingly unremitting pessimism, this is where the author of Adorno's, or the secondary reading on Adorno, N.J. Ringer, thinks that Adorno can make a real contribution to the study of international politics. And he notes that a lot of IR theory that draws on the Frankfurt school overlooks Adorno's thought. They focus more on Jürgen Habermas, who we'll look at in a couple of days. And while Habermas criticizes modern societies, both domestic societies and international civil society, in various different ways, and while he also sees instrumental reason as being really important in his analysis, he does understand it slightly differently, and he's slightly more optimistic about our possibility of escaping instrumental reason. Habermas is of the view that we can work towards emancipation, and he has a definite positive account of what emancipation consists in and how we can get there, right? So that sounds great. Well, he must be way better than Adorno, right? Ringer thinks no. He thinks we need both of them. Adorno can make a real contribution, and he can temper Habermas's perhaps unjustified optimism, because he thinks that international relations theory, in the Habermasian vein, insufficiently gives attention to this problem that Adorno identifies, the problem of complete domination and instrumental reason. It's insufficiently critical of itself, and it doesn't do enough to recognize the way that its own project of emancipation is compromised by being embedded itself in instrumental reason. So Ringer illustrates this idea by adopting this analogy of Plato's cave, which you may have come across before in a philosophy class. So we're all sitting in Plato's cave. We're facing into the wall here. Light comes in from the entrance, from behind us, and it creates these shadows on the wall, right? And we all study, in IR, we're studying these shadows, and we're taking these shadows to be reality. Right? We make up these really complicated theories about the shadows and the movements, and we can predict what shadows are going to do, where they're going to move, and so on, right? And these theories tell us actually important things, but ultimately they're theories about shadows that we mistake for reality. They're not reality itself, right? So I would say, like realism, for example, according to this view, it's the study of shadows, and it creates really complicated theories, but it's taking the shadows to be reality when they're actually not. The critical theorist, on the other hand, according to this view, is able to get up and leave the cave, to go outside and get a glimpse of how things really are, about how the world really is. And perhaps we can think of Adorno in this way. So Adorno, he's a critical theorist who's got up and he's left this cave. Habermas, however, Ringer thinks, is a critical theorist who's got up, left the cave, and then come back in, right? And the reason why he wants to go back into the cave is he wants to change the nature of the cave. He wants to change society. He wants to bring his understanding from outside back into the people in the cave who are still watching these shadows. But there's a reason why Adorno leaves the cave and doesn't go back into the cave, because once you go back in, once you try to use the knowledge that you got outside to change things in the cave, you're once again subject to the way things work in the cave, the logic of the cave. You can only change things by following the rules of the cave. You can only explain things by reference to the ideas and the logics and the theories of the shadow watchers, right? So if you go back into the cave, your project of trying to change the cave is going to be inevitably compromised. And this is where Ringer thinks that Adorno and Habermas can kind of help each other out a little bit. So you have to go back into the cave, he thinks, right? A critical theory that merely criticizes isn't much of a critical theory at all. But when you go back into the cave, you have to do so with the knowledge that actually Adorno is right. Right? When you go back and you are going to be compromised. You do become subject to and have your project contaminated by instrumental reason. Right? As soon as you propose and work towards any kind of emancipation, you're going to have your project compromised by instrumental reason. As soon as your account is what we call programmatic, right? As soon as it tries to change the world, to intervene in the world, it has to use instrumental reason to do so. And so in this way, Ringer thinks that Adorno is this corrective to these overly optimistic critical IR theories. It requires these theorists to recognize the ways in which they themselves may be implicated in the very thing that they're trying to change. So any truly critical theory of international politics, Ringer thinks, has to engage with Adorno's dark side, right? As much as it does have to engage with Habermas's optimistic face of critical theory. Okay, now that we have a better understanding of Adorno's account of enlightenment and how this applies to society and to critical theory, we're in a position to understand his own view of dialectics that gives us a slightly different Adorno-inflected account of immanent critique. And we do have time, right? Okay, we do have time, good. So the idea for Adorno is that there's no such thing as a whole, right? However, classical Hegelian dialectics, right, and immanent critique that's based in this kind of Hegelian philosophy always treat the whole as more important than the particular. Because Hegel, if you recall, has this thesis and this antithesis, and the conflict between them creates the synthesis, right? The thesis is a whole, the antithesis is this opposite of the thesis, but it's also a whole, and then the synthesis that comes out of them is this new whole. Adorno is kind of suspicious of this view. For him, any kind of concept, any kind of synthesis that purports to be a whole always leaves something behind. Right? Our language, our concepts, our theoretical frameworks never completely capture what they're trying to describe. So our thought, and particularly our thought that's expressed through language and through concepts, always leaves something out. So instead of Hegel's positive dialectic, a dialectic of wholes, Adorno offers his own negative dialectic. So he says, rather than a thesis and an antithesis, an opposite and its contradiction, engaging in this dialectical conflict, we should instead think of this conflict in terms of a thesis or a concept and its negative in the sense of all of the things that that concept leaves out. Right? Any concept for Adorno needs to be thought against, right? Due to the way that it maybe relegates certain things to the realm of non-identity. It says that certain things are just not worth paying attention to. And we can think of this in a way like shining a torch on something, right? A concept or a word or a theory is like a torch. We use it to shine a light on something in the world. But as soon as we shine a light on something, the opposite side is left in shadow, right? The light's hitting one side, the other side is in shadow. So negative dialectics, then, is this other contribution that Adorno could perhaps make to IR theory. And this is captured by his line that to lend a voice to suffering is a condition of all truth. This doesn't just mean that for Adorno we ought to care about suffering, because I think few people would disagree that suffering is bad and we should stop it. Rather, he means that if we want to understand the world in a meaningful, critical kind of way, we need to pay attention to particular suffering, real suffering, right? Actual, concrete suffering of real human beings. right? And we should think about how this suffering in particular escapes our language and our concepts and our theories, how it doesn't take it into account. And then we should reconsider our language and our concepts and our theories in light of noting that this actual concrete real-world suffering is not captured in our existing language and concepts and theories. The unity of the whole, he thinks, is achieved at the price of perpetrating violence against these particulars. And that violence is not just sort of innocent conceptual violence for him, it's violence that has real consequences for real human beings. Now, of course, we do run into a bit of a problem here. Even if we reconsider our language, and we reconsider our concepts, and we reconsider our theories in light of this concrete attention to real-world actual suffering of human beings, we're still going to have to use language and concepts and theories to describe the suffering that we're now paying attention to. And we're then going to run into the exact same problem of exclusion and elision, right? Still, things are always going to be missed. Things are always going to be left out. Now, one way of getting around this is to completely subjectify concrete suffering. So it's to treat each instance of suffering as particular and as singular and as unable to be associated with any other instance of suffering that exists. But if we do that, if we see each instance of suffering as being isolated from every other instance of suffering, then this actually works against the emancipatory aims of critical theory just as much as the use of concepts and theories do, if not more so. Because if we're going to do anything about actual real suffering in the world, we need concepts and we need language because we need to see the connection between things, right? The structures that underlie society and that give rise to that suffering to begin with. Concepts are important, concepts are powerful, concepts help us to understand the world. So instead of completely subjectifying suffering in this way, instead of taking suffering into account as these unique singular individual instances, Adorno suggests that we use instead constellations of concepts. So each concept, he thinks, has its blind spots, it has things that it leaves out, but by employing a constellation of concepts together, by grouping them, hopefully different concepts will make up for, to a certain extent, never perfectly, but to a certain extent, the gaps and the flaws in the other concepts in that constellation. All right, almost at the end, don't worry. So what does negative dialectics mean for international relations? Well, first, as I said, we need to pay attention to suffering. Any account of international politics that doesn't foreground actual concrete human suffering is insufficiently critical, according to this point of view. We need to rethink our concepts and our theories and our language in light of this real suffering. And we need to employ constellations of concepts in our theory so that we can adequately, or at least as adequately as we're able to, give voice to the suffering, to capture it in our theories and our language and in our concepts. So any critical theory of international affairs that does not give a voice to suffering in this way can't get at the real important truth for Adorno of international affairs. Secondly, it offers a kind of embodied cosmopolitanism that helps us to understand not what our ultimate goal should be. It doesn't give us a positive account of emancipation, but it tells us what we should avoid, right? It tells us what a damaged life would be like. So we should no longer be trying to develop this blueprint for the good life and apply this to everyone or to all of society, but we should instead understand things negatively. Right? We should understand what is it that's bad, what is it that we should be resisting, what is it that gives rise to human suffering. So this negative dialectics and Adorno and Horkheimer's negative view of the Enlightenment, I think is something worth keeping in mind as you engage in this course. Because as the author of the primary reading points out, these ideas something that may actually be able to act as a bridge between the Frankfurt school and the post-structuralists who we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, so that was pretty heavy stuff. But on Thursday, we'll be looking at the foremost thinker of the next generation of the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Habermas,